In this video, I'll be going over React Components, Elements, and JSX. This video is a continuation of the last video where we set up a development environment and created a React project named Hello World. My name is Larry, and this is Digital Logic. So I've already got the project open in VS Code, so I'll open the console and start the development server with npm run start. Once the developer server is running, open up a web page to localhost at port 3000, and then hit F12 to open up the developer tools, and then open the React developer tools. So back in VS Code, I'm going to close the terminal and then open up the index.js file. Unfortunately, when I recorded this video, React 18 dropped 2 days later, and the ReactDom.render method has been depreciated in favor of this. So anytime I edit the JSX within the ReactDom.render method, you'll be editing the content in the root.render method. The ReactDom.render method renders a React element into the supplied container, in this case an HTML element with the ID of root. This syntax is called JSX. So what exactly is JSX? Let's create a new constant, element equals h2 hello world. JSX may look like HTML, but it isn't. JSX is a syntax extension to JavaScript, and it allows us to define UI elements with the full power of JavaScript. You don't need to use JSX to create a React element. You can use the react.createElement function call. The first parameter defines the element type, in this case, an h2 element. The second parameter defines the properties that are passed to this element. These can include a class name or an HTML attribute. Since we're not passing any properties to the h2 element, I'm going to set this to null. Any additional parameters passed into this function call define the children for this element. In this case, this component only has one child, and that's the text, hello world. This function then returns a JavaScript object that React uses to update the DOM. Both of these elements are equivalent. They both produce the same HTML output, and they both evaluate to JavaScript objects. To see what a React elements object would look like, let's print one out to the console. Save the file, and then open up the browser. If you're using Chrome and the console is hidden, press the escape key to bring it up. And then let's expand this object. So it has a type property set to h2, and then within the props property, we have our children's property. So I'll go back to VS Code, and then make the React element a little bit more complex. So I'll add a class name property to the h2 tag. My class doesn't exist, but this is just for a demonstration. To assign a class to an element, in JSX you'll use the property class name. Press Ctrl S to save the file, and then check the results in the browser. And as you can see, we have a new attribute, class name. So let's go back to VS Code, and this time I'm going to wrap the h2 element in a div. Move the closing div tag, and then I'll add another element. When creating a JSX expression that spans multiple lines, it's recommended to surround the expression with parentheses. This will prevent automatic semicolon insertion from doing anything weird. This isn't required, but the React documentation recommends it. Save the document, and let's take a look at the console output. So the root element has a type of div, and if we expand the props property, and then the children property, we can see the other two elements. So all React components generate JSX, which will get transformed into a similar object structure. Let's go back to VS Code. So real quick, I'll show you how to add a class property to an element created with the react.createElement function. And that's all there is to it. Any other properties or attributes that you want to add to this element would just be key value pairs within this object. Now that we've got a React element, how do we get React to render it? So what I'm going to do is select the JSX within the ReactDom render method and then comment it out. And then just add the element. Notice that I am not surrounding it with angle brackets. Save the file, and then let's check the output. The element is rendered to the DOM. Notice in the React developer tools that we don't have any components listed. What I want to do is convert this element into a React component. All a component is a function that returns a React element, or JSX. So all we need to do is modify our element so that it's a function that returns JSX. And now we have a React component. If you're to save the file now and check the results in the browser, you'll notice that we're getting an error. But at least the error message is very descriptive. And that is that we're trying to pass in a function instead of an actual component to be rendered. So let's go back to VS Code and fix this problem. So one possible solution is just to execute this function. But this is the exact same thing as passing in a React element into the render function. And when we check the results in the browser, it's the same as before. Instead of executing the component like a function, I'm going to surround it with angle brackets. Save the file, and let's check the results. And we're still getting an error, only now the error states that the tag element is unrecognized in the browser. If you meant to render a React component, start its name with an uppercase letter. So back to VS Code. So the problem that we have here is that only native components can start with a lowercase letter. Native components include div, h1, h2, p, span, and so on. Custom elements that are not native to the browser have to start with an uppercase letter. So I'll just capitalize the first character in the element variable. And I'm going to get rid of the console log statement as well. Save the file and check the results in the browser. And it is working again. Also notice that in the React developer tools, we have a single component named element. So let's go back to VS Code and then delete the element component from the render function. And then remove the comments from the original code. And then I'll comment out everything that I've added. The React.ScriptMode component is a tool that will highlight any potential problems within your app. It doesn't render anything to the DOM, and it only runs in development mode, so it doesn't have any effect on a production build. A few things strict mode checks is unsafe component lifecycles, depreciated or legacy API usage, and unexpected side effects. To get a full list of what strict mode detects, check out the React docs. So let's take a look at the app.js file. So I'm just going to select and delete everything within the header tag. When creating new components, normally you'd define each component in a separate file. But to keep things simple, I'm going to define each new component in this file. Remember that a React component is just a function that returns JSX. So let's create a new function, and I'll name it welcome. And then we just need to return some JSX. And then let's go ahead and add this component to our app. Save the file, and then check the results. In the React developer tools, you can see that we have our welcome component. But what if we wanted to customize the message to the user that's currently logged in? So go back to VS Code, and then we'll add a custom property to the welcome component. And I'll call this property name equals John. Any properties that we define on a component will be passed to the component's function as a props parameter. You can insert JavaScript expressions into JSX by wrapping them in curly brackets. But only JavaScript expressions. That means no if statements, no for loops, or function declarations. Now just retrieve the value from the props property. Save the file, and then check the results. So the text has been updated, but also notice that React developer tools list the properties that a component has. There is one strict rule that all React components must follow, and that is that a component cannot modify the properties that it's provided. It can transform its output for display, but you cannot modify the property's object or any of its keyed values. In this example, the name has been capitalized, but the original property has not been modified. So I'll remove the call to 2 uppercase. And now I'll use object destructuring to create a new variable that references the name property. We could even move the destructuring into the function parameter. Of course, now we no longer have direct access to the props object. The welcome component is an example of a functional component, but we can also define components using ES6 classes. Now, I won't be going into detail on ES6 classes or the prototype chain, but if it's a subject that you're unfamiliar with, you might want to check it out on your own. So to define a React component using ES6 classes, we have to start with the class keyword, and I'll name this component hello, and then extends react.component. And make sure to import the React library. The only required method within a class component is the render method, which will return JSX. And for now, I'll just leave it as static text. And then remove the welcome component from the app's JSX, and then add the hello component. Save the file, and then check the results. And it's working as expected. And just like in the welcome component, I'm going to pass in a name property to the hello component. To access the properties in a class-based component, use this.props. Save the file, and then check the output in your browser. With ES6 classes, you can define a constructor function to initialize instance variables. If you define a constructor in a React component, make sure to pass the props object to the parent object using the super keyword. And just like in functional components, you can destructure the props object. Just make sure to only do this in the render method. Don't create and use instance variables that just copy the component's properties. This is to make sure that the component will update if the component's properties were to change. And then save the file and check the output. Now we'll move on to component composition, and this is really where React shines. So I'm going to remove the hello component from the app and then create a new component. And this will be a functional component, which I'll name list. And then we're going to return some JSX. I'll add an h3 tag, and I'll call this to-do list. And then I'll add a UL element, which is a unordered list. And we've got an error in our JSX. Let's ignore this error for the moment and add this component to our app. Save the file, and let's check out the results in the browser. The error message states that adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. We're getting this error because JSX has to translate into a JavaScript object with a single type property. This property specifies the component's root element. In this case, we don't have a single root element. The simple solution is to wrap our two elements in a div. And format the code. And then if we check the output in the browser, you can see that it's working. If you don't want to wrap adjacent elements in something that would render to the DOM, you can use the React.Fragment component. Save the file, and then check the results. And then let's take a look at the HTML. And we've got our two adjacent elements without anything wrapped around them. So I'm going to change it back to using a div as the wrapping element. And now let's add some list items to the unordered list. Save the file and check the output in the browser. So right now, our list component consists of nothing but native elements. And there's nothing wrong with this, but we'd have more flexibility if we extract the list items into their own component. So I'll create a new function, and I'll name it list item. And then pass in the prop item. And then return a list item. Now let's update the list component to use the list item component. Save the file, and let's check the results in the browser. And now in the React Developer Tools, we have our list component with each list item in it. Now you may be wondering, why convert the li element into a React component? React components can, and often do, include CSS styling and JavaScript logic encapsulated within them. Breaking up UI elements into reusable components will reduce code duplication within your application and make it easier to build more complex UI elements. Right now, our list item component receives the text to display as an item prop. We could make it more natural to use the list item component by passing the text or JSX element to the list item as a child to the component. Save the file, and then check the results in the browser, and you'll see that our text is missing. The text for our component is now being passed down as a children property. So just modify our component real quick. Save the file, and then check the results. Click on the list item component in the React Developer Tools, and notice that we have a children property with our component's text. So right now, our list items are defined within the list component, but we can extract them out of the list component. So delete the list item from the list component, and then go down to the app component and modify the list element to include a separate closing tag. And then paste the list item as a child to the list element. And then I'll add a second list item. Now we need to define where the list component will display its children elements. So I'll destructure the children property from the props parameter, and then insert it into the UI element inside curly brackets. Save the file and check the output. And if you click on the list component, you can see that it has a children property with an array of React elements. So now the list component is more of a container component, since we're no longer defining the elements within it, but instead passing them down as children. Now, when would you choose to define elements directly in a component or pass them down as a children prop or some other prop? The answer is it depends. It depends on the type of component that you're creating, and it depends on where the logic and data for that component reside. To summarize everything that I've covered in this video, JSX is a syntax extension to JavaScript. After compilation, JSX expressions become regular JavaScript objects. React components can be defined as functional components or class-based components. React components allow you to break up UI elements into independent and reusable pieces, which can then be composed into more complex components. And that is it for this video. If you like this video, then please like, share, subscribe. If you want to support the creation of these videos, then check out my Patreon page. A link is in the description, and I'll see you in the next video.